On Christmas night, 1991, the red flag came down over the Kremlin and a different flag went up, quieter and smaller, as if the world had agreed to lower its voice. In Washington, analysts wrote end-of-era memos and began talking about a peace dividend. In Moscow, people stood in bread lines and tried to remember what certainty felt like. And somewhere inside the collapsing machinery of the Soviet state, men who had spent their lives living in secrets watched the lights flicker and did not panic. They did what professionals do when the building catches fire. They saved the files. They moved the money. They protected the networks. And they waited. The KGB, the most feared set of initials in a half-century of shadow, was supposed to die. With the Soviet Union, it was dissolved on paper, divided into smaller agencies, stripped of its mythology. The West took a victory lap and assumed the story was over. But history rarely ends. It changes its uniform. Tonight, we're telling the story of what rose in the vacuum after 1991. Not a resurrected KGB in the exact Soviet form, but a new security state built from the old bones, reshaped, rebranded, and rearmed for a world of banks, satellites, and screens. We're calling it Operation Nightfall, a way to describe the long, deliberate resurgence of Russia's security services after the Cold War and the quiet campaign to reassert influence abroad while consolidating power at home. The title is ours, not an official code name. The pattern is real. To understand Nightfall, you have to start with the myth that made it possible. That defeat automatically produces reform. Part 1. The day the KGB ended. In the frantic months of 1991, Soviet institutions collapsed in fast motion. After the August coup attempt failed, the Communist Party's monopoly shattered. The KGB tied to the coup. Plotters in public imagination, whether fairly or not, became a symbol of the old tyranny. In October 1991, President Boris Yeltsin moved to dismantle it. The KGB was formally abolished. Its responsibilities split into new bodies. The Federal Counterintelligence Service, which later became the FSB, the Foreign Intelligence Arm, the SVR, and other structures for communications and protection. On paper, this looked like a clean break. In practice, it was an administrative metamorphosis. Most of the personnel stayed. Many of the habits stayed. And crucially, many of the archives stayed, now guarded by men whose careers depended on what those archives could do. In the 1990s, Russia was unstable. The economy convulsed through shock therapy. Oligarchs emerged. Organized crime expanded. Regional governors acted like barons. The state lost control over tax collection and, at times, over violence itself. For ordinary people, the victory of democracy felt like humiliation and theft. For security officers trained to believe the state is everything, it felt like the apocalypse. That chaos became the first fuel for Nightfall. Because when people fear disorder more than oppression, they will pay almost any price for stability. Part 2. The survival instinct. Intelligence services have a unique advantage in a collapsing state. They already know how to operate without permission. They have clandestine networks, access to weapons, and an intimate map of who owes whom. They understand leverage. And in the early 1990s, as ministries went broke and police salaries evaporated, the old KGB ecosystem adapted to a new market. Some officers left and became security consultants for banks and oligarchs. Others stayed inside the new agencies and learned a new mission language. Not class struggle, but counterterrorism. Not ideological war, but sovereignty. Yet the tools were familiar: surveillance, Kompromat, and the careful cultivation of influence. Kompromat, the collection and strategic release of compromising material, was not invented by the KGB, but the KGB elevated it into an art. In a democracy, elections can be influenced by ads. In a weak democracy, they can be influenced by a tape. In a corrupt system, they can be influenced by the promise that the tape will never be released if you cooperate. By the mid-1990s, Kompromat had become a currency in Moscow's power economy. And the men most skilled at minting it were the men who had never truly left. Part 3. The Chechen Crucible. Nightfall needed more than survival. It needed a narrative. And it found one in fire. Chechnya, a small republic in the North Caucasus, declared independence in 1991. Russia's first war to stop it began in 1994 under Yeltsin, a brutal conflict broadcast on television in a way that made the state look incompetent as well as violent. Russia lost prestige, soldiers, and control. A humiliating ceasefire followed in 1996. Then came the Second War, 1999, launched under the banner of restoring order and crushing terrorism after a series of apartment bombings in Russian cities. Those bombings killed hundreds and shocked the country. The official narrative blamed Chechen militants. The episode remains contested in some circles. What is undeniable is the political effect. Fear turned into permission. The Second Chechen War became the crucible in which Russia's new leadership forged itself. It elevated security services as the guardians of the nation, taught that war, even a dirty one, can create legitimacy, and it produced a new kind of public figure, the ex-intelligence officer as savior. Part 4. The Rise of the Siloviki. In 1998, Boris Yeltsin appointed a relatively obscure former KGB officer as director of the
FSB, Vladimir Putin.
A year later, he became prime minister. By the end of 1999, he was acting president. In 2000, he won election. Putin's ascent was not just a personal story. It was institutional. It marked the rise of the Siloviki, men from the power ministries of security, military, and law enforcement, into the commanding heights of the state. Under Putin, the security apparatus did not merely serve the Kremlin. It became the Kremlin's backbone. The methods were subtle at first. Federal power was reasserted over governors. Oligarchs were brought to heel selectively. Media was consolidated into friendlier hands. Courts became less independent. The FSB's prestige rose. The message was clear. The era of chaos is over. The state is back. And the people who could guarantee that were the people who knew how to control. This was Nightfall's second fuel, the restoration myth. A nation humiliated can be rallied by the promise that it will not be humiliated again. Part 5. The External Mission Reborn. The Soviet Union's collapse had shrunk Russia's borders and broken its empire. NATO expanded eastward. Former satellites joined Western institutions. Color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine signaled that post-Soviet states could slip from Moscow's orbit without a tank crossing a border. For Russia's security elite, this was not normal geopolitics. It was a threat to regime survival. If neighboring societies could overthrow corrupt leaders through street protests, why not Russians? So the foreign mission of Russian intelligence shifted. It wasn't about spreading communism anymore. It was about preventing contagion, preventing democratic movements, and Western influence from undermining Moscow's control. That mission produced a new toolbox suited to the Internet era. Classic espionage continued. Recruiting sources, stealing secrets, running illegals. But the cost-effective weapons became influence operations, cyber intrusions, and the cultivation of political relationships abroad, what intelligence officers sometimes call active measures. The same old phrase in a new grammar. Instead of exporting ideology, the mission became exporting confusion. If you can't make the West love you, make it doubt itself. Part 6. The Gray Zone Doctrine. Nightfall's most important innovation was not technical. It was strategic. Russia learned to operate in the gray zone, below the threshold of formal war but above ordinary diplomacy. The goal was to create ambiguity so that opponents hesitate. Was it a cybercriminal or a state? A protest movement or a manipulated one? A separatist uprising or a covert invasion? This ambiguity is not an accident. It is a doctrine, and it allowed Russia to pursue objectives while keeping escalation manageable. Cyber operations fit perfectly. They were deniable, cheap, and scalable. Hack a ministry, leak emails, embarrass a leader, and you don't need an army. Combine cyber theft with propaganda and you can shape perceptions at a fraction of the cost of tanks. The modern Russian security ecosystem was not the KGB reborn as a single giant. It was a networked constellation, the FSB for internal control and counterintelligence, the SVR for foreign intelligence, the GRU military intelligence for aggressive operations, and a universe of proxies, contractors, patriotic hackers, and criminal groups that could be nudged, paid, or tolerated. Nightfall thrived in that ecosystem because it blurred the line between state and non-state. In a world where attribution is slow, speed is a weapon. Part 7, The Signal Fires Abroad. By the mid-2000s, the Resurgence announced itself in signal fires. In 2006, Alexander Litvinenko, a former FSB officer and outspoken critic of the Kremlin, was poisoned in London with polonium-210, a radioactive substance. British investigations later concluded that Russian state actors were likely responsible, and a UK public inquiry found that the killing was probably approved by senior figures. The message, whether intended as such or not, was chilling. Exile does not equal safety. In 2007, cyber attacks crippled parts of Estonia after a dispute over a Soviet-era monument. The attacks were a preview of what modern disruption could look like: websites down, services strained, a digital siege without a single soldier crossing a border. In 2008, war erupted in Georgia. Russia intervened militarily and later recognized the independence of breakaway regions. The conflict showed Moscow's willingness to use force in its near-abroad and its ability to pair kinetic power with information operations. In 2014, after Ukraine's Maidan Revolution, Russia annexed Crimea and supported separatists in eastern Ukraine. Little green men without insignia became a symbol of gray zone warfare. The operation combined special forces, local proxies, propaganda, and a strategic narrative about protecting Russians and correcting history. Across these episodes, the pattern was consistent. Avoid direct confrontation with NATO, but exploit seams, act quickly, and shape the story. Part 8, Influence as a Weapon. Nightfall's most enduring battlefield wasn't in trenches. It was in minds. Influence operations evolved from leaflets and radio broadcasts into social media. Campaigns, hacked and leaked documents, and narrative amplification. The objective was rarely to convince everyone of one truth. It was to convince enough people that truth is unknowable, that institutions are corrupt, that democracy is a sham. This approach works best in open societies because openness is a strength that can be exploited. Free speech allows propaganda to enter. Social networks reward outrage. Divisions within societies become entry points. For Americans, this became visible through multiple episodes and investigations in the 2010s. Regardless of specific cases and debates over impact, the broader phenomenon is widely documented. Russian-linked actors used online platforms to amplify polarization, undermine trust, and shape narratives about elections, race, immigration, and public health. The tactics weren't always sophisticated. They didn't have to be. Volume and timing mattered more than brilliance. And at the center of it was an intelligence mentality. Operations designed to make targets do the work to themselves. Part 9, The Home Front, Control as National Security. Nightfall's external operations cannot be separated from its domestic architecture. The post-Cold War Russian state built stability by narrowing the space for political competition. NGOs faced foreign agent laws. Independent media was pressured or shut down. Opposition leaders were harassed, imprisoned, or worse. Elections continued, but the playing field grew less real. From the perspective of the Siloviki, this was not tyranny. It was defense. The 1990s had taught them that weakness invites predation. NATO expansion, color revolutions, and Western democracy promotion were interpreted not as values but as tactics. Under that worldview, internal dissent becomes a security threat by definition. This is the logic that turns a security service into a political system. When every disagreement is framed as sabotage, the state becomes permanently mobilized against its own citizens. Part 10. The Paradox of Resurgence. So did the KGB come back? Not exactly. The Soviet KGB was a colossal instrument, serving a single-party state ideology. Post-1991 Russia built something different. Security-led state serving power, continuity, and sovereignty as ideology. The methods echo the KGB because the personnel and institutional memory persisted. But the operating environment changed. Money became as important as ideology. Oligarchs and intelligence services became entangled. Private wealth and state power braided into a system where loyalty could be purchased and punishment was selective but terrifying. The paradox is that this resurgence was not just about strength. It was also about fear of chaos, fear of humiliation, fear of losing control. Nightfall is the story of a state that decided stability is worth any cost, and of a security apparatus that learned to treat that decision as both mandate and mission. Part 11. The American Mirror. For an American audience, the temptation is to view this story as foreign and distant. It isn't. Russia's resurgence forced the United States to confront uncomfortable truths about its own vulnerabilities, the fragility of trust, the speed of information contagion, the difficulty of defending open systems without damaging what makes them open. The Cold War had taught Americans to measure threats in missiles and divisions. Nightfall demanded a different measurement. Narrative warfare, cyber disruption, gray zone coercion. It required new institutions, new coordination between intelligence and law enforcement, and new public literacy about how influence works. It also revived old dilemmas. How to respond proportionally, how to deter without escalating, how to call out actions without giving them the publicity they crave. Part 12. The Crisis That Never Ends. The story of Nightfall doesn't end with a treaty or a flag change. Continues because the conditions that fed it remain: Russia's unresolved post-Soviet identity, the security elites, belief that the West is an adversary by nature, and the strategic utility of operating below the threshold of war. The modern era adds more accelerants: AI-generated propaganda, deepfakes, cyber tools, sold on criminal markets, and global financial networks that can hide money as effectively as spycraft once hid messages. And yet, the core is still human. A state that fears losing control will build systems that prioritize control. A society that has lived through humiliation will seek restoration. An intelligence apparatus that survived collapse will believe it can survive anything until it meets something it cannot surveil or coerce. Epilogue: What Nightfall reveals. Operation Nightfall, as we've called it, is not a single conspiracy or a secret memo. It is a pattern of behavior shaped by history. The dissolution of an empire, the trauma of the 1990s, the rise of a security-led elite, and the adaptation of old tradecraft to new technology. It is also a warning, not just about Russia but about any system anywhere that decides. Fear is a governing philosophy. Intelligence services exist to protect states. When they become the state's identity, they stop protecting and start consuming. The last image is not of a spy meeting a handler under a bridge. It is of an ordinary citizen, looking at a screen, unsure what to believe, exhausted by competing truths. That exhaustion is not collateral damage. It is often the objective, because the most powerful form of control is not the one that forces you to agree. It's the one that makes you stop trying to know. And if the Cold War taught the world how close it can come to catastrophe, Nightfall teaches a quieter lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous empires are not the ones that rise with flags and armies, but the ones that return through habits, until you realize the night didn't fall all at once, it simply never ended.